Well, again, good Sabbath to everyone. Last week, we talked about the commonly held belief in the immortal soul. Most Christian churches today teach that we're all born with an immortal soul that just continues on after one's death. But our Bibles actually contradict this doctrine. For example, last Sabbath, we saw that the phrase immortal soul never appears anywhere in the entire Bible. And Solomon tells us that the dead know not anything. Ezekiel tells us that soul that sins, it shall die. Job tells us that man is mortal. Peter tells us that King David did not ascend to heaven, but rather he remains in his grave today. John 3, verse 13 tells us that no man, woman, nor thing has ever gone to heaven, except, of course, Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul tells us that we are mortal beings that must put on immortality, and that this can only be done through Jesus Christ. But if humans don't have immortal souls today, as so many errantly teach, how do we attain immortality to ultimately come to live for eternity with Jesus Christ and our loved ones? Well, the answer is by way of the resurrections. There are people today who don't believe in the resurrections. Back in Jesus' day, we know that the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrections. For example, Mark 12, verse 18, "Then came unto him," meaning Jesus, "the Sadducees, which say there is no resurrection." Actually, neither did the Sadducees believe in the immortal soul. So the Sadducees believed that when a person dies, that's it. They're dead, never to be seen or heard from again. As I've said before, I'm sure that made the Sadducees of Jesus' day very sad, you see. Now, I don't want us to be sad, you see. So I'd like to look at the resurrections in our Bibles, both past and future. I believe this will give us all great hope, not sadness. Hope for us and hope for all those we love. Now, for today, I'd like to look at the resurrections of the past, all except for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We'll be looking at the resurrection of Christ and all the future resurrections next Sabbath, so that'll be exciting. Don't want to miss that. Today, let's get started with our first resurrection from the Bible in the way of physical resurrections. Let's look at 1 Kings, that is, 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 8. Let's go ahead and look at 1 Kings 17, verse 8. I think a lot of people don't think about the physical resurrections very much, but we'll talk about this. But anyway, here in 1 Kings chapter 17, there had been no rain, nor even dew in the land. Not surprisingly, there was a great famine. We might recall that God sent Elijah to the widow of Zarephath after the brook near him dried up. Let's pick up the story at the point where God told Elijah to go to Zarephath, where he would find a widow that would take care of him. Again, 1 Kings 17, verse 8. "And the word of the Lord came unto him," that's Elijah, saying, "Arise, get you to Zarephath, which belongs to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain you." Now, otherwise, Elijah would have died without food and water in this terrible drought. Verse 10. "So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, the widow woman was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Fetch me, I pray you, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to fetch it, he called to her and said, Bring me, I pray you, a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse. And behold, I am gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. Now, this widow was running out of food in this famine. She had only a handful of grain and just a little bit of oil. So she was planning to eat that with her son, and after that, she believed that both she and her son would then starve to death, basically. But look at what Elijah says in verse 13. And Elijah said to her, "Fear not. Go and do as you have said, but make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it to me, and after make for you and your son. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." So Elijah told the widow that her food basically would not run out until the drought was over. That was a promise from Elijah. Verse 15. And she went and did according to the saying of Elijah. And she and he and her house did eat many days. And the barrel of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by Elijah. So just as Elijah promised, that tiny amount of food lasted well beyond what it normally would have. This was a miracle, I suppose, and this was great. But unfortunately, right after that, the widow's son became ill and died, so he died anyway. Verse 17. And it came to pass, after these things, that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, fell sick, and his sickness was so sore that there was no breath left in him. In other words, the widow's son was dead. Verse 18. And she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you, O you man of God? Are you come to me to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son?" Well, the widow here was basically blaming Elijah for her son's death. Verse 19. And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him out of her bosom. Or as most translations say, he took the boy from her arms, and carried him up into a loft, where he abode, and laid him upon his own bed. And he cried unto the Lord, and said, O Lord my God, have you also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn, by slaying her son? And he stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and cried to the Lord, and said, O Lord my God, I pray you, let this child's soul come into him again. The word soul here means life. Most other translations read, let this child's life come into him again. Verse 22. And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. And so the dead child was revived or resurrected back to life. Verse 23. And Elijah took the child and brought him down out of the chamber into the house, and delivered him unto his mother. And Elijah said, See, your son lives. The woman said to Elijah, Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. So Elijah raised this boy from the dead, or resurrected him, right? Well, actually, it was God that resurrected the boy. Elijah prayed to God, and God heard his prayer and raised the boy back to life. Okay, let's turn over to 2 Kings for the next one, next resurrection of the dead. That's 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 11. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 11. And this is the resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son. We pick up the story, this woman had no son. Now, we're told she was a very good woman, and she had made a place in her home for Elisha to stay when he was in town. She offered him a lot of hospitality. Elisha recognized the good in this woman. He appreciated what she and her husband were doing for him, and he wanted to do something for her. Again, 2 Kings 4, verse 11. I'll be reading this account in the Contemporary English Version. The next time Elisha was in Shunem, he stopped at their house and went up to his room to rest. Well, that's the room the woman had prepared for Elisha to use when he was in town. That was very nice of her. Verse 12. He said to his servant Gehazi, This woman has been very helpful. Have her come up here to the roof for a moment. She came, and Elisha told Gehazi to say to her, "You've gone to a lot of trouble for us. We want to help you. Is there something we can request the king or army commander to do?" The woman answered, "With my relatives nearby, I have everything I need." "Then what can we do for her?" Elisha asked Gehazi. Gehazi replied, "Well, I do know that her husband is old and that she doesn't have a son." "Ask her to come here again," Elisha told his servant. He called for her, and she came and stood in the doorway of Elisha's room. Elisha said to her, "Next year at this time, you'll be holding your own baby son in your arms." Often women have a problem believing that when they're told that, right? We've seen that before. Let's go ahead. "You're a man of God," the woman replied. "Please don't lie to me." But a few months later, the woman got pregnant. She gave birth to a son, just as Elisha has promised. Well, I'm sure this woman was absolutely elated to have a son at last. So this is great news, right? But, there's a but here. But, verse 18. One day while the boy was still young, he was out in the fields with his father, where the workers were harvesting the crops. Suddenly he shouted, "My head hurts. It hurts a lot." "Carry him back to his mother," the father said to the servant. The servant picked up the boy and carried him to his mother. The boy lay in her lap all morning, and by noon he was dead. This woman's precious son had died. Verse 21. She carried him upstairs to Elisha's room and laid him across the bed. Then she walked out and shut the door behind her. The woman called to her husband, "I need to see the prophet. Let me use one of the donkeys. Send a servant along with me and let me leave now so I can get back quickly." "Why do you need to see him today?" her husband asked. "It's not the Sabbath or time for the new moon festival." "That's all right," she answered. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Let's go, and don't slow down unless I tell you to." She left at once for Mount Carmel to talk with Elisha. When Elisha saw her coming, he said, "Gehazi, look, it's the woman from Shunem. Run and meet her and ask her if everything is all right with her and her family." "Everything is fine," she answered Gehazi. But as soon as she got to the top of the mountain, she went over and grabbed Elisha by the feet. Gehazi started toward her to push her away when Elisha said, "Leave her alone. Don't you see how sad she is? But the Lord hasn't told me why." The woman said, "Sir, I begged you not to get my hopes up. I didn't even ask you for a son." Verse 29. "Gehazi, get ready and go to her house," Elisha said. "Take along my walking stick, and when you get there, lay it on the boy's face. Don't stop to talk to anyone, even if they try to talk to you." But the boy's mother said to Elisha, "I swear by the living Lord and by your own life that I won't leave without you." So Elisha got up and went with them. Gehazi ran on ahead and laid Elijah's walking stick on the boy's face, but the boy didn't move or make a sound. Gehazi ran back to Elisha and said, "The boy didn't wake up." Elisha arrived at the woman's house and went straight to his room, where he saw the boy's body on his bed. He walked in, shut the door, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and stretched out over the dead body with his mouth over the boy's mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hand on his hands. As he lay there, the boy's body became warm. Elijah got up and walked back and forth in the room. Then he went back and leaned over the boy's body. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elijah called out to Gehazi, "Have the boy's mother come here." Gehazi did, and when she was at the door, Elisha said, "You can take your son." She came in and bowed down at Elisha's feet. Then she picked up her son and left. So here we see Elisha was involved in this young boy's return to life, or his resurrection back to life. Let's move ahead to 2 Kings 13, verse 20. That's 2 Kings chapter 13, not far away, in verse 20. Was Elisha involved in any more resurrections of the dead? I think we might find these next few passages interesting. Well, I'm not sure if interesting is the right word for what we're about to see. But again, that's 2 Kings 13, verse 20. It tells us, and Elisha died, and they buried him. So now Elisha was dead. Let's continue. And the bands of the Moabites invaded the land at the coming in of the year. The Bible in Basic English reads, Now in the spring of the year, armed band of Moabites frequently came overrunning the land. Of course, the coming in or the beginning of the year in those days was in the spring, unlike in the wintertime as it is on today's Gregorian calendar. But verse 21, And it came to pass, as they were burying a man, that behold, they spied a band of men. Now, these were men of the invading army, and I'm sure that those burying this man were fearful of this band of men and were in a bit of a hurry to get out of there. I know I would be. Let's see what happened. And they cast the man into the sepulchre of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood upon his feet. Wow. When this man they tried to bury ended up falling onto Elisha's dead body, that dead man was resurrected back to life right then and there. So we see here that even after Elisha's death, he was still around, or at least his body was, for yet another resurrection of the dead. When the body of that man who was being buried came into contact with Elisha's bones, he was resurrected back to life. I would assume that God still had a purpose for this dead man and brought him back to life. Let's turn next over to Mark, if you would. That's Mark chapter 5, verse 21. That's Mark chapter 5, verse 21. Here we'll see a ruler of the synagogue named Jairus. Now, he petitioned Jesus to come and heal his daughter that was near death. Let's pick up the story in Mark chapter 5, verse 21. And when Jesus was passed over again by ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea. And behold, there came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet, and besought him greatly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. I pray you, come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and that she may live. And Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him, or as the easy-to-read version says, they were pushing very close around him. Verse 25. Now, on the way, you'll remember this story. We'll go ahead and look at it. Verse 25. As they were walking, and a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse, when she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind, or the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. We're probably all familiar with this story, but let's go ahead and continue in this verse 29. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, Who touched my clothes? His disciples said to him, You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, Who touched me? And he looked around about to see her that had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. And he, Jesus, said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace and be whole of your plague. This woman was healed of her chronic condition, which is what Jairus was hoping Jesus would do for his daughter, right? But remember, while the woman was pushing through the crowd to be healed by Jesus, he was on his way to Jairus' house to heal his daughter, who was very ill. Let's continue in verse 35. So here we are. He's on his way to heal the sick daughter. While he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble you the master any further? So as Jesus and Jairus were on the way to Jairus' daughter, a messenger from the house brought them the news that Jairus' daughter had died. At that point, there was no need to trouble the master any further. In other words, there was no need for Jesus to come to the house because it was too late for her. She was already dead. Was it really too late for Jesus to save the little girl? Verse 36. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Be not afraid, only believe." And he suffered no man to follow him save Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And so Jesus, Peter, James, and his brother John continued on their way to Jairus' house. Verse 38. And he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw the tumult, and them that wept and wailed greatly. These people were really upset. They were very sad at the death of this little girl. Verse 39. And when he was come in, he said to them, "Why make you this ado, or disturbance, and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleeps." Now, Jesus often refers to those who have actually died as being asleep, because he knows that all that have died will one day be awakened. They'll be awakened from their sleep. We'll really see this when we get to the resurrection of Lazarus shortly. But let's continue in verse 40. So, how did the people react when Jesus spoke those words? When he said that, how did they react? The damsel is not dead, but sleeps. How'd they take that? Verse 40. And they laughed him to scorn. But when he had put them all out, he took the father and the mother of the damsel and them that were with him, and entered in where the damsel was lying. He took the damsel by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which is, being interpreted, Damsel, I say unto you, arise. And straightway the damsel arose and walked, for she was the age of 12 years. And they were astonished with a great astonishment. I can imagine that. So here we see a young girl resurrected back to life, this time facilitated by Jesus Christ himself. Let's look at another one here in Luke chapter 7 this time. Luke chapter 7 and verse 11. That's Luke chapter 7, verse 11. Now this will be the resurrection of the man at Nain. I don't believe he's named. But again, that's Luke chapter 7, verse 11. I think Jesus just came upon this. Let's see. Luke 7:11. And it came to pass the day after that he, Jesus, went into a city called Nain. And many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Now when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. Here we see another widow with her only son dead. Verse 13. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, or the coffin, basically. And they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. And he that was dead sat up, and began to speak. And he delivered him to his mother. There came a fear on all, and they glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God has visited his people. And this rumor of him went forth throughout all of Judea, and throughout all the region round about. Wow. Now, in Jesus' day, a person wasn't considered to be officially and legally dead until they appeared to be dead for 3 whole days. If someone appeared to be dead, but let's say woke up a day or two later after it was assumed they were dead, well, then they really mustn't have been dead in the very first place. Turn next, let's go to John chapter 11, right there in verse 1. Remember what I just said here. John chapter 11, verse 1. John chapter 11, beginning verse 1. Let's look at the account of the resurrection of Lazarus. This is probably one of the more well known of the past resurrections, I believe, except maybe that of Jesus Christ. But again, keep in mind that a person needed to appear dead for 3 whole days to be considered officially dead at that time. So again, John 11, verse 1. Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sister sent unto him, Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. Well, notice what Jesus says here. First, there was a purpose for Lazarus' death. His death would demonstrate the glory of God. The Son of God, Jesus himself, would be glorified somehow by Lazarus' death. Now, this sickness was not unto death. That sounds a little odd. But as we said earlier, Jesus often speaks of our death as sleep. Today, what we call death is not final. We know we will all live again. Now, the second death we read about in places like Revelation 2, verse 11, or Revelation 20, verse 6, 20, verse 14, and Revelation 21, verse 8. Well, that's truly death, since those who suffer their second death will not be resurrected back to life. They will be truly dead in every sense of the word. They'll not be raised from their sleep. We'll talk more about that next week. Well, let's continue in verse 5. Now, Jesus loved Martha and his sister and Lazarus. So, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was very sick, did he leave immediately to go see his sick friend like I would think he would do? Verse 6. When he had heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days, still in the same place where he was. So why would Jesus wait for 2 days to begin his journey to visit Lazarus? And we know that the purpose of Lazarus' death was to glorify God. If Jesus had gone straight to Lazarus as soon as he heard the news, he probably would have been dead about 2 days. By delaying 2 additional days, then Jesus would arrive about 4 days after Lazarus' death. And resurrecting Lazarus after 4 days would be a genuine resurrection of the dead. People couldn't claim that Jesus brought Lazarus back to life, say after 2 days, because a person was not considered officially dead until 3 days had passed from their apparent death. Maybe the person was just unconscious. Maybe they had a temporary illness of some kind that mimicked death. But after 4 days, there was absolutely no doubt that Lazarus was truly dead. There were some physical indications of that too, we can read. But at this point, a resurrection of Lazarus by Jesus would truly be a miracle and clearly show the glory of God. That's why I suspect Jesus waited those 2 days before leaving for Bethany, to ensure that he and his disciples didn't arrive too soon and resurrect Lazarus before his full 3 days of death. So, after waiting for 2 days, verse 7, John 11, verse 7. Then after the 2 days, said he to his disciples, Let us go into Judea again. His disciples said unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone you, and go you there again? So, some living near Bethany and elsewhere had planned to do Jesus harm before. The disciples weren't too keen about going back there and possibly putting their lives in danger. Verse 9. Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbles not, because he sees the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbles, because there is no light in him. These things said he, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. Now, Jesus knew Lazarus had died, but notice Jesus' use of the term sleep to describe his condition here in verse 11. Jesus said Lazarus slept, like the little girl. But his disciples didn't understand. Verse 12. Then said his disciples, Lord, If he sleep, he shall do well. Howbeit, Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking of rest and sleep. They didn't understand the use of Jesus' term sleep there. Verse 14. So then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And now they understood. And I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. So he was glad he wasn't there earlier, he says. Now, the disciples, as we talked about before, especially now before they had the Holy Spirit at least, at that time they had issues with their belief. And again, an immediate resurrection of Lazarus as soon as he died would not necessarily have shown the glory of God. Again, people could say he wasn't really dead. After 4 days, they couldn't say that. Verse 16. Then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. So he wasn't thinking they were going to be welcomed at all. He was kind of concerned. So I think Thomas was particularly pessimistic of their chances to survive this trip, but Thomas went along with Jesus anyway. He did follow him anyway, like we should do, right? Verse 17. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. So again, we see Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. 1 whole day passed, the 3 days required for an official death. Drop down to verse 21. Verse 21. Then said Martha to Jesus, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother had not died. But of course, this was the plan, right? Continuing, she says, but I know that even now, whatsoever you will ask of God, God will give it you. Jesus said to her, your brother shall rise again. Now, Martha knew that one day all the dead, including her brother, will be resurrected back to life. When would that be? Well, for one thing, it could be at the last day that we've talked so much about. If we're not familiar with the last day, we'll be talking about it in detail in an upcoming message, so you want to hear that for sure. But notice Martha's recognition of God's last day in verse 24. Martha said to him, Jesus, she said, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. The resurrection at the last day. We'll talk more about that next week. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Well, again, Jesus sees our death today as temporary. Like sleep, we will awaken from our death. But in the future, there will be those who die a second death. They will not be awakened after that. As I said before, they will be truly dead. Lazarus wasn't truly dead yet. He had some time to go. Verse 27. She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. So I don't think Martha, Jesus' disciples, or anyone standing around were actually expecting Jesus to resurrect Lazarus right then and there. I mean, that was going to be a surprise. Drop down to verse 34. And Jesus said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then said the Jews, behold, how he loved him. And some of them said, could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? But again, remember, we know there was a purpose for Lazarus' death. Verse 38. Jesus, therefore, again, groaning in himself, came to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, take you away the stone. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time he stinks, for he has been dead 4 days. Again, this is going to be, proof that Lazarus was indeed dead. He wasn't asleep or anything else. Verse 40. Jesus said to her, said I not unto you that if you would believe, you should see the glory of God? Then he took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you hear me always. But because of the people which stand by, it's for their benefit here, I said that they may believe that you have sent me. So the people were standing around. They were going to witness what Jesus was about to do that was going to prove that Jesus was indeed sent by the Father, to prove that he was the Son of God. Verse 43. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus said to them, Loose him and let him go. Yet another resurrection of a human being back from the dead to live again. You know, most who believe in the immortal soul would have Lazarus in heaven at his death, or possibly in that burning hell. We might note that Jesus did not recall Lazarus from heaven or hell. He went to where Lazarus was, where he was buried, to resurrect him back to life. Let's fast forward now to the death of Jesus Christ. Matthew 27, verse 50. Matthew 27, verse 50. We're going to talk about his resurrection next week, but there's something else I wanted to look at. Because here we'll see that there were the resurrections of many saints at the time of Jesus' death and resurrection. Again, Matthew 27, verse 50. This is when Jesus died on the stake or the cross, whichever. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the spirit. In other words, Jesus died here. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose. So at this time the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, or in other words, were resurrected, and came out of their graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city and appeared unto many. Now, we don't know the exact number that were resurrected then. We only know that there were many. Let's go ahead and finish in verse 54. Now, the centurion and they that were with him, watching Jesus, saw the earthquake and those things that were done. They feared greatly, saying, Truly, this was the Son of God. But there were many of the dead resurrected at the time of Christ's death and resurrection. So, how many? Not sure. Many. Acts 9, verse 36, for our next resurrection. And this will be the resurrection of Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, I believe. And she was a good woman full of good works. Again, that's Acts 9, verse 36. Acts 9, 36. Now there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and alms deeds which she did. And it came to pass in those days that she became sick and died, whom when they had washed, they laid her in an upper chamber. And forasmuch as Lydda was nigh to Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent unto him 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he was come, they brought him into the upper chamber, and all the widows stood by him weeping, and showing the coats and garments which Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all forth, and kneeled down, and prayed, and turning him to the body said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. Another resurrection of the dead. And he gave her his hand, and lifted her up. And when he had called the saints and widows, presented her alive. And it was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Another resurrection. Now, I'm not sure how you're doing right now, and I hope my messages haven't put anyone to sleep. I hope I haven't had anyone fall out of a window, or worse still, I hope no one has fallen out of a window only to be killed. But that's exactly what happened during one of Paul's sermons. Let's hope it doesn't happen to me today. Guys, stay awake, please. So let's turn over to Acts chapter 20, if you would. That's Acts chapter 20, verse 9. You may be familiar with this. That's Acts 20, verse 9. Let's see what happened to poor Eutychus as he sat in a window listening to Paul preach. So guys, get out of the windows, okay? Now, granted, it was late this evening. I'll give him credit for that. Again, Acts 20, verse 9. And there sat in a window a certain young man named Eutychus, being fallen into a deep sleep, and as Paul was long preaching, there's his problem there, he sunk down with sleep and fell down from the third loft and was taken up dead. The Bible says he was dead. So Eutychus, apparently put to sleep by Paul's long preaching, I suppose, fell from a third-story window and was killed. He was dead. Verse 10. And Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him, said, Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him. When he therefore was come up again, and had broken bread, and eaten, and talked a long while, even till break of day, so he departed. And they brought the young man alive, and were not a little comforted. So I suppose they were very comforted that this young man wasn't still dead. But Paul took care of that. So again, dead as we read in verse 9. He was dead and he was resurrected. Okay, we're coming to the end here. Now for something possibly different. For our last scripture today, I think it's the last scripture. Let's go to Jonah. Jonah, chapter 1, verse 17. Jonah, chapter 1, we'll start in verse 17. Now, you might be saying, I'm not recalling a resurrection in the book of Jonah. Well, you might be right. I'd like to take a look. I'd like to see what I've got here. I've heard this before, and it's very interesting, but I know most of us know the story of Jonah and the great fish. But again, let's look at it in Jonah 1, beginning in verse 17. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. I think we know that Jesus gave a sign to the Pharisees that would prove that Jesus was who he said he was. He said it was the only sign he would give. But what was that sign? Well, in Matthew 12, verse 40, Jesus said to the Pharisees, For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So Jonah was in his grave for 3 days and 3 nights, just as Christ. The question is, was Jonah alive the whole time, that whole 3 days and 3 nights in that great fish's belly? Or was he dead? Now, if he was dead, then he must have been resurrected from the dead to have lived again and gone on to Nineveh. Maybe some of us hadn't thought of this. Let's start again in Jonah 1, verse 17. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly. Now, it would appear here that Jonah prayed after he'd been in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, meaning he was still alive then. Of course, that would seem impossible, barring a miraculous intervention by God, which he certainly could do. But the interesting thing here is in the original text, the word then wasn't there. Let me read the same verse in the Contemporary English Version. It just says, From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. Modern King James Version. And Jonah prayed to Jehovah, his God, out of the fish's belly. So really, we don't know exactly when Jonah prayed to God. We only know he did so after the fish swallowed him. Verse 2. And Jonah said, I cried by reason of mine affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me out of the belly of hell. Of course, hell from the Hebrew Sheol means the grave. Out of the belly of hell, or the grave, cried I, and you heard my voice. For you had cast me into the deep, in the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about. All your billows and your waves passed over me. And I said, I am cast out of your sight. Yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The death closed me around about. The weeds were wrapped about my head. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet have you brought up my life from corruption, O Lord my God. Brought up my life from corruption. Well, based on other parts of the Bible, that sounds like Jonah was dead. But notice how the easy-to-read version translates this verse. It says, I was at the bottom of the sea, the place where the mountains begin. I thought I was locked into this prison forever. But the Lord my God took me out of my grave. God, you gave me life again. That's directly from the Bible there. So, what I was going to say is, anyway. Since we know, hang on one second. Okay, what I want to remind you of, I lost a place there. What I remind you of is in Matthew 12, verse 40, Jesus said, For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, since we know that Christ was dead for those 3 days and 3 nights in his tomb or his grave, the question becomes, was Jonah dead as well during his 3 days and nights inside the whale's belly in his grave? And then, as Christ, resurrected the third day. I'm not positive about this, but I thought it was something we might want to think about. Give us some consideration. Let me know what you think. To conclude today, there were many resurrections of the dead back to life in our past. My point today was not to make us sad, you see, but to remind us of the many physical resurrections of the dead that have occurred in the past. There have been many. Most people tend to forget this, I believe. And of course, we also know that many physical resurrections will be occurring in our future. Martha knew about them. The physical resurrections of the future will bring the dead, in fact, all the dead at that time, back to life. That includes all our loved ones that we've lost over time. As the Bible tells us, all will hear his voice and come forth. But there's something more than the physical resurrections we've seen today. A resurrection where we're headed for death all over again. All those who were physically resurrected in the Bible in the past, they eventually died again. But there's a resurrection that can give us eternal life. A resurrection that promises us eternal life in the kingdom of God, where we will live in peace and safety with our loved ones and Jesus Christ and the Father for eternity. So be sure and be with us next week when we look at the resurrections coming in our future.